We spent a lot of time talking about the transgender issue, the activism, parents trying to fight back, protect their children from policies, and of course, the creeping of the transgender persona within our popular culture, best personified by Dylan Mulvaney representing Bud Light. And well, that hasn't worked out well for Bud Light. The discussion continues in many corners of the internet. It's an argument, a very, very fierce argument. But our next guest, one of our favorite writers, David Marcus, he's written over at Fox News that maybe where we are right now in this conversation lends itself to a compromise, some kind of agreement. All right, David, I think it was a very thoughtful piece, and I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thanks. Yeah, I started writing the column over the weekend when I saw two interviews. The first was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think it was either on ABC or CNN, saying that he thought it was unfair for biological men to play sports with biological women. Second
Yeah.
one was GOP candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, who had an extended exchange with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press about whether gender is set by biological sex and binary. And what really leapt out to me was that last year, neither of those conversations could have happened on those networks because the rule was that to even question transgenderism did harm to the transgender community. And so you just don't talk about it. Think back to 2014 when Kevin Williamson wrote an op ed called Laverne Cox is Not a Woman for the Chicago
Yeah,
Sun-Times. Do you
I
remember
remember.
that?
Yeah, I do.
Chicago Sun-Times retracted that article. They literally said you are not allowed to express that opinion in the newspaper.
Right,
That's over now. That's changed because we have to talk about women's prisons and women's sports and women's shelters and how this impacts kids, obviously.
right. So you lay out in your column, I think, a very true reality, which is we have two sides of this argument, and if you look at I don't want to use the word extremes, but let's just say the folks on either side of this argument that are most adherent to their position. You've got on one side the idea that any suggestion that a person can change their pronouns, change their gender identity, live their life as the opposite sex, that if we accept that or allow somebody to do it, then we're living a lie and we're upending Western civilization. But we've got another side of the argument that says if you dare to even challenge somebody's right to do all of these things, as well as biological men competing against women, biological men going into women's safe spaces like girls' room and locker rooms, then you are a bigot, you're a homophobe, and you don't have a place in our society. How do we get those two sides of this argument to reach some kind of compromise?
I think you probably don't get those extreme elements to reach a kind of compromise. But I think that most people fall somewhere in the middle where almost what we had before we started talking about this could kind of work. Where, like, yes, if you want to live, if you're a man and you want to wear dresses and you want to call yourself a certain name, that can be accommodated by social norms, even perhaps to some degree um, by public policy. But there are certain things that conservatives in particular are not going to accept. We're not going to say things that we don't believe. We're not going to let kids make these life-altering decisions, below the age of 18. So there are definitely firm lines in the sand. But this is also the United States, and people are free to live the way that they want to live, more or less.
So it's kind of a libertarian position you're taking, which is you live your life as long as you're not forcing me to accept it or you're forcing yourself into my realm.
Yeah, and listen, Larry, this is a 60-40 issue, right? I mean, the polling in 2022 showed 60% of Americans said, no, this is what you're born as, that's what you are. That was up slightly from the year before, so it's actually sort of trending in that direction. But there's still 40% of Americans who say, hey, if you think you're a woman, you're a woman.
Right.
So, look, the West Village is going to look different than West Virginia, right? Like, this is going to manifest itself in all kinds of different ways throughout our society. But societies do that, right? I mean, let's not forget that for thousands of years, myriad civilizations had eunuchs, right? These were basically an artificially created third gender who played this role in society. So, you know, th- these are social issues, these are scientific issues, these are political issues, and the way through them is to have open and honest conversations, which I think we're finally able to do now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I think that there does need to be some accommodation. I was struck by the photograph of Riley Gaines who we had on earlier in the program actually to get an update on protecting women's sports. She posed for a picture with the athlete formerly known as Bruce, Caitlyn
Yep.
Jenner.
Yep.
Bruce Jenner, as an adult, transitioned to a woman. That's fine. But see, I saw that picture and I liked it, but at the same time, I was like, wait a minute. Caitlyn Jenner was given, the hero sports icon of the year by ESPN. Why? That there still seems to be an intrusion here where women end up being the victims.
Yeah, look, I think that Jenner in particular is pretty sensitive to a lot of these issues, and has shown that to some extent. And I said when this whole Bud Light thing happened, it's not about Mulvaney being trans, right? If there was some TikTok spot where it was Caitlyn Jenner with a Bud Light, nobody would have cared. The issue is that Mulvaney is engaging in woman face, and there's this sort of like demeaning aspect to this bit that he's doing, right? That's the
Yeah.
problem with Mulvaney, and there's a difference. So, look, I don't think men can become women, but I also know that I'm not going to convince all of the 40%, the 100 whatever million Americans who think that they can, that they're wrong. So, one way or the other, we're going to have to live with this.
You make a case in your article, David, and again, it is a great article, as is most of your writing, and so I do want people to read it. But you say that figuring out, taking these two very polar positions and finding out some kind of middle ground compromise and accommodation so that our society can move forward. It's a very American thing to do, and you're right. The fact that we resolved our issues over slavery, such as they were, to reach a Declaration of Independence, and we basically just put it off for another 85 years, and then we broke out in a war. Ultimately, I think that is a good thing. It's not a good thing that we had a war, but we prioritized where we were as a country, and we came together on what was needed. This feels different to me, and I guess I'll give you the final word here because I want to be as optimistic as you are, but I don't see these sides moving. It's so entrenched.
Look, I think one way to look at this is the fact that we've always had sort of subsets in American society of people who live very differently, right? Think about the Amish, just completely off the grid, right? Think about Orthodox Jews in the middle of New York City. And we do make public accommodation, right? Like the Amish and the Quakers don't have to fight in wars. Like our country and our culture are capable of making these
Right.
kinds of compromises. And
I lied. I'm not going to let you have the last word because
yeah,
you're right about that. However, we as a society also draw the lines on certain moral and ethical standards. The Mormons, before Utah was allowed into the country, we said, no, you got to do away with polygamy. And they did to
absolutely.
accommodate. So we do draw lines some places.
We must. Yeah, we have to.
So the question is, will we be able to draw that line here? Will we
Look,
be will,
yes, I
will
think there
those
are
who
lines
say
for
no men are men or
conservatives.
women are women, can't that be the
No,
line that we draw?
yeah, I- it can be the line that we draw as far as public policy issues like prisons and sports and school. But can it be in education? I don't know, right? I mean, given that
Yeah.
40% of Americans think that gender is fluid, can we just teach kids that? How do we teach that? Do we say some people believe this, but it's not rooted in science? Like, there's all these questions that we need to be able to have a conversation about. And I think, again, I think we're now at a place where we can start to have these kinds of conversations.
All right, that will be the last word, and amen to that. Listen, the best point that you make in this is that 10 years ago we couldn't even have this conversation; we'd be
Nope.
canceled. For once, the pendulum swung a little bit more in the area of free speech, and an important speech it is. David Marcus, great stuff as always. Thanks for joining us. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight. Salem News.